Jason. Thanks,
Yep,
Jason.
thank you. And I'll turn the meeting over to you.
Well, at this point, I know thank everybody for being here tonight, and I'm glad we got some new members on this work group. That's terrific. So we've kind of talked at prior meetings about trying to sort of utilize our time in the work groups to address specific topics instead of kind of bouncing all over the areas. And I know previously we had talked about getting a speaker in to talk to us with regard to impairment and how that's going to be handled with respect to medical cannabis in West Virginia. And so Jason was kind enough to try to work with the state police to get us a speaker here. I understand we have Michael Smith present. Thank you, sir, for coming tonight. If it's okay with the rest of the members of the work group, I'd kind of like to just dive into that presentation unless anybody has anything they want to address first.
We're good.
All right. Mr. Smith, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can. Thank you for having me. Like I say, it's always nice to see what's going on and, just to keep up on, the new trends and, as things advance into, the future of medicine and, the things that you hadn't seen before. All this is somewhat new to me. Anyway, I've been a state trooper for 25 years. 20 years of it was narcotics. The last 10 years, I've ran the state's outdoor and indoor marijuana grow operations with the helicopters and things of that nature. And then I did pharmaceutical diversion for probably about another 7 years, where we focused on the improper prescribing outside the bounds of medical acceptance. So I'm somewhat versed in the marijuana and also, in the prescribing of, mostly opioids. But Jason asked me to come in and to answer questions that you guys might have. As far as the presentation, I really don't know what you guys want to hear, or if you guys just want to ask me certain questions. What I did today is I've been teaching in service for our CE credits for state troopers, and to this date, I'm almost done. I have one more week, and what we're doing there is doing an educational presentation to the troopers and explaining to them about the dispensaries, the growers, and the processors, what to look for, the ID cards, the scan, the barcodes, that would be on the bottle or the container, and then also, the barcode, obviously, that's on the IDs. So that's what we've done. Now, I was also supposed to, and I'm getting most of it completed, but I was also given a deadline by the end of June. I'm supposed to have trained every police officer in the state on domestic cannabis. Or I'm sorry, not domestic cannabis, medical cannabis. So that's what I've been working on lately. And then Jason, like I say, Jason asked me to attend this meeting and to perhaps answer some questions.
Well, we appreciate you being here. I don't know if it's Trooper Smith or you have a different title we should address you with.
No, I'm a first sergeant, but like I say, most people call me Mike, and I'm good with that.
Well, Mike, we appreciate you being here to answer some questions. I mean, it seems like it's sort of a brave new world for everybody in this. And one thing that's come up in prior work group meetings and then with the full advisory board has been the fact that it seems there's really not a uniform standard for impairment with respect to operating vehicles or machinery or things like that. And, I know that, from my experience as an attorney, it seems it's very difficult to get any kind of set standard for marijuana impairment cases, particularly with DUIs. And so we kind of wondered what law enforcement's thoughts were on that and what you guys are looking for in that, because it's not that it's simple to deal with an alcohol DUI, but we do have a guideline. You can use an intoxilizer. You can look at that baseline. Are they over 0.08? And I understand there's other factors for impairment, and that sometimes you have to go off the officer's observations, even in alcohol cases. But I didn't know if there was any kind of movement through the state police or law enforcement in general to set any kind of parameters or limits, or how you folks would test that from the DUI perspective? So that's a question I have. And of course, there's other members here that may have other questions, but maybe that's an area you could help us with a little bit as to what law enforcement is currently doing.
Yes, sir. That's a good question. And I have never arrested somebody and charged them with a DUI involving marijuana. So, of course, and again, I've been out of uniform for, 20 years. So that's not really my bailiwick. But what I did do is I reached out to a couple instructors that we have that actually teach the methods and the standard of what they would do, on a I guess, an impaired driver. From what they told me is, of course, with alcohol, there's the state's primary test is breath. So, alcohol being totally different, you can get a reading, by intoximeter or by a PBT, to where even if they pass field sobriety, technically, if they go over a 0.08, that's, I guess, prima facie evidence, and they're still obviously under the influence of alcohol. Now, under the influence or up below the level of 0.08, if they still fail field sobriety, then that's still enough to charge for the DUI and oftentimes get a conviction. But what happens is when we're dealing with marijuana specifically, I would look at it almost identical to prescription pills. And what would happen on a DUI in general is it would be the offense in which the vehicle was stopped for. If it's just a whiteout, then everybody can have a whiteout. So it's really not that big an indicator. If you're following the car and he is from white line to white line, erratic braking, not dimming his high beams, showing signs of what would be consistent with fatigue or intoxication, that could be an indicator on the traffic stop to lead into, I guess, reasonable suspicion to look into other things. Then when you get in the vehicle, obviously, if you smell the odor of marijuana, that's an issue in itself. Everything from when you ask the person for the driver's license and the reason that you stopped them, if the response is clear and crisp, then that's one thing. If the person struggles and doesn't know, incoherent, and doesn't know, where his driver's license is, or he's fumbling around, and he's just not crisp and clear thinking when he's going through the process, then that could be a very good indicator. At that point, your case would progress to gathering more evidence. The guy might even confess and say, "Yeah, I've been smoking marijuana." At some point, if the policeman gets to the point that they have enough reasonable suspicion, I guess probable cause, to ask the person to step out of the vehicle, they would subject them to a series of structured field sobriety tests. The field sobriety test would be the biggest indicator on someone's level of intoxication.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wondered, there are specialized tests for drug recognition that are currently utilized, right?
I've heard of some of them being out there. We, to my knowledge, we don't have any.
Okay.
Meaning,
sorry,
no. What we would have to do, and that's where I was going, is where we would have to go to as far as confirming. If the person is obviously he's failed field sobriety and he's under the influence, at which time he would be subject to the policeman actually would have to write a search warrant or get consent to get blood. At which time, you would have to see what the results were when the blood came back, and I think anything under 0.0 or 3 nanograms, I think, is what they're calling prima facie or marijuana.
Yeah, and that's one of those issues. We as a board are sort of charged with: do we make recommendations to the legislature about any additional laws that might be needed? And I know that the nanogram levels have been a big issue across the country. There's been fights about where to set those levels, because unlike alcohol that metabolizes fairly quickly, with marijuana, you're in a situation where the more somebody uses, the more their blood level may keep sort of a baseline for a much longer period of time. And so I know there's kind of a fight over those nanograms, and maybe a fight may be the wrong word, but there's some disputes within other states about where to set those nanogram levels because of those issues. And I didn't know if that's something that, in your experience, had been looked at, or if you'd have any thoughts you might want to share with us on those.
No, most of the time, I'll be honest with you. And again, this is, you're going back on, this is 20 years ago. And I hate to even admit this, but if I pulled somebody over and I thought they had too much to drink, I usually called their wife, or had somebody come and get them, or I took them back to their house and made sure they weren't going to be in their vehicle for that evening. If they were a productive, person in the community, and it wasn't an habitual person, and I felt that they weren't going to be a harm to themselves or another person. So routinely, I didn't really go off of the mere fact, oh, could this guy be a 0.08? Could he be a 0.10? If it was anything in question, I erred back on the other side. So, and of course, there's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of court that goes in with this. And most of these guys out there are not really interested. There's so much stuff that we're busy with. They are not interested at all in nickel and diming somebody on a case, because it's just, it's a lot of paperwork, and it generates a lot of work if you arrest somebody that's not clearly intoxicated or under the influence. So, I spoke to several guys today and asked if they had arrested anybody for driving a vehicle or operating equipment under the influence of marijuana, and they had not. But I'm sure there has been. I mean, I know there's people out there. I just haven't found. I didn't find anybody today that had.
Sure.
The pills, pills are a big one too. At one point, I mean, you pull somebody over and you knew that they were impaired, by the times I talked about, but you would get a breath sample and they blow zero. And then, eventually we found out, that you have to do, blood tests. And once you get into that, then you find out that they had a high concentration of like benzodiazepines or opioids. So yeah, this is a new process. I really don't foresee anybody getting improperly targeted. I haven't seen that before, and marijuana's been here since, before I came. But it's new. I mean, again, it's going to change. Eventually there might be a device that comes out to where you can do some type of testing. And, as far as what the level is, I don't know. I mean, that's probably going to be more in the scientific area from, a physician or somebody that there's some type of study that, that shows a certain nanogram level that everybody agrees on.
Yeah, and to that, first of all, thank you, Sergeant Smith, for participating and for sharing your insight and information on this. But to the scientific issue, when we had Dr. Greg Gerdeman come on, and he actually spoke to this, and he has made himself available to participate in this discussion if we would like him to come back. But when he was talking about it, he was talking about how the way that the cannabinoids interact with you on an individual level. Everybody's endocannabinoid system processes these cannabinoids differently, and the terpene profiles of the specific strain also affects the body differently. And he was saying that because of there are so many factors, with alcohol, we can regulate. We know exactly what the alcohol percentage is in, from beer all the way up to hard liquor. But with cannabis, with thousands and thousands of strains of cannabis out there with different terpene profiles, different cannabinoid profiles, and taking into account that the human body, like my body's going to process it and it's going to affect me differently than you. He was talking about how there's really no way to come up with a defined baseline. And he and I spoke not long after the Medical Cannabis Act was passed. I was the one that was leading the effort to get the Medical Cannabis Act passed, and these were questions that we were constantly getting from lawmakers. And initially, after Governor Justice signed it into law, I flew out to Colorado specifically to speak with people in opposition. I went out there. I didn't want to speak into an echo chamber, and I didn't want to hear, from people who obviously supported this issue. And I spoke with a handful of law enforcement officers out there, and everyone I spoke with said the exact same thing that you said about field sobriety test. If an officer pulls someone over and they suspect impairment, that field sobriety test is basically the best mechanism they have, because if you pull someone over on opioids or benzos or whatever, you obviously can tell they're impaired, but you have no idea how much of that is in their system. Like you said, it takes a blood test. But I just wanted to say that I appreciate you coming on and sharing that information. And also, if we want to bring Dr. Gerdeman back in to talk about the endocannabinoid system and but the issues that industry and law enforcement have run into when trying to develop a roadside test, he said that he would be more than willing to come back and participate in another discussion and help us get through this process.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt, and that sounds great. And my biggest thing is, and I can tell this story, and I'll make it real fast. But there was a chief of police, and he was in a very small city, and he wasn't certified on the intoximeter. He ended up pulling this girl over, and he knew the family, and she was heavily under the influence of, he suspected, prescription medication. But he had no idea. He didn't have the training, and like I say, he was in his 80s, and he thought what he was going to do was to call the parents and to notify the parents and take her back to the parents and release the girl over to the parents. She ends up sneaking out of the house later that night, gets in a vehicle, hits a guy head on, and then severely injures a guy. And the chief of police got sued for like $1 million. And it was the same attorney that fought us tooth and nail on anytime we arrested somebody for DUI. So most of these guys, when they're doing a DUI, it's not necessarily that they want to scratch or they want to contact or they get a bonus or anything like that. It's more so some of it's liability. Do we feel responsible with in-car cameras now and body cameras and all that? Do we feel responsible on letting this person drive? And that's where the responsibility comes back to the person. So if you let them go and they end up hitting somebody, you got to be really careful on that. So that's the biggest factor, that goes into whether or not you do the DUI approach or you call somebody and have them come and get them. When it's nice to call somebody and come and get them, but at the same time, if they sneak off later that night, sometimes they can come back and get you.
Well, to that point, I mean, it's something worth at least kind of thinking about in our discussions, that from a legal perspective, you have liability with bars and restaurants and even liquor stores if they serve intoxicated people that they know are intoxicated and they know that they're going to be driving away from the area. And some of that is, are they visibly impaired to the point where they shouldn't be driving, and yet the bartender continues to serve and knowing they're driving. And you can have civil liability against those establishments. That's something that will be interesting to see how things play out in the dispensary context. Maybe not so much at this point with medical marijuana, but in the event that the state would ever go towards recreational, you could see much more of that potentially. So that's something that's worth thinking about. Sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, sir.
No, go ahead, please.
One of the issues I've been dealing with is edibles, and we had some edibles come in from California, and they're selling them in gas stations, and the THC content is 20%. And what's happening is it's like a bag of Doritos, and they say Doritos on them. You can't tell them apart. They smell like Doritos, but each chip is one dosage unit. So if you eat one chip, you're supposed to wait 20 minutes because it has to go through the stomach and get processed and all that. And what's happening is these people get a bag of chips and eat the whole bag of chips, and then 40 minutes later they're zonked out.
Just with this being new to West Virginia, I just wondered whether or not you all have conferred with other states who been up and running with medical marijuana and the policing thereof of medical marijuana in other states, just to get some insight, because this is all new. It's going to be all new to us.
Yes, we did. We have sent people out to Colorado, and had them perform practice field sobriety on, I guess, individuals that volunteered to ingest cannabis, and to, you know, give a time period for it to go in their system and to see how they responded to field sobriety tests.
Was there experience that they were able to determine impairment from any of those cases, or did they come back and say, well, no, we never found anybody who was dysfunctional?
No, they did. It depends, from what they told me, it depended on the strain of the marijuana. It largely depended on whether it was an edible versus smoking. And then it also, which makes sense. I mean, it's going to be two different deliveries. You know, the smoking's going to go directly to the brain, and then, you know, the other has to go through your stomach, and it's going to be a prolonged time period, and, you know, it can stack up on you, and you can't really pace yourself. And then there was some strains that they smoked it, and they observed no intoxication.
Yeah,
And again,
that gets back into the science of it. You know, Dr. Gerdeman was also talking about how cannabis, that plant, you know, the cannabinoid CBD, the way that CBD and THC works together. If a patient picks up, you know, a strain or a product that is a 1-to-1 ratio, there really is no intoxication, because that CBD actually blocks the THC receptors in your brain. You know, so there's all of those strains and all of those terpene profiles really come into play when we're talking about impairment. That's why, again, coming up with a baseline. I know that in statute here, you know, in code, the list of prohibitions about, you know, not being able to drive a car or operate heavy machinery or anything like that, I believe is 3 nanograms of active THC per milliliter of blood. But even with that, you know, 3 nanograms in a patient who has just started using medical cannabis versus 3 nanograms in a patient who's been using cannabis for years, you know, the impairment's going to be completely different. It's really a fascinating, like, when you get into the science of how these terpenes and cannabinoids work with the body, it's really fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. And the same thing with opiates. I was amazed. There was some people that were taking, you know, that I was dealing with, that were taking like 15 and 20, you know, Lortabs a day and functioning. And then, you know, and I've never really used an opioid, but, you know, I ended up taking one after a surgery, and and it did what it was designed to do. You know, one got me where I wanted to go.
I'm very encouraged that, you know, to hear that that West Virginia law enforcement has sent officers out there, you know, out to legal states to conduct this kind of research. It's very encouraging, and I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you, sir. And I think it's old. I think I want to go back to the field sobriety. If the guy can't pass field sobriety, if he's showing signs of intoxication, you know, that's going to be your biggest factor. You know, and, you know, yes, it is going to be subjective, you know, on the officer's part, but at the same time, you know, he's kind of, if he lies about it, he's taking a good chance to lose a license and lose his licensure. You know, he has a lot to lose if he lies about it, more than what he has to gain. You know, of course, then the other side of the brain, you have to factor in, you know, if he lets them go and they end up hitting somebody, is it, you know, it's going to be his decision. Is he going to be able to, you know, fight that one off as well?
I mean, it's just another issue about all this is that we don't have any restrictions on the amount of THC that can be in our products, and that that high level THC in some instances, I think, can definitely, from my personal experience, unfortunately, the higher the potency, the more dysfunctional I would become, you know, when utilizing it. And I think that is something I think that we still need to be concerned about, that people can get their hands on high potency THC without any rails. And I think that's going to continue to be a concern and problematic if we're not careful.
Again, that's where the science also comes in. When you're talking to a cancer patient, and you give a patient who, like when I was going through cancer, like say everybody knows that it was not legal in West Virginia. When I was illegally using cannabis to get through chemotherapy, but some of the concentrates I was using was upwards of 80% THC. That's what I needed as a cancer patient to get through the side effects of chemotherapy. And every time that I've heard limiting THC, and when I hear that, all I hear is, well, you're just placing more of a financial burden on that patient because their need isn't going to be diminished. So they're just going to end up spending more money to get what they need, which is problematic to people going through situations like that. I was completely financially devastated going through cancer. And when you look at this issue in other states, nobody else has limited THC content in medical cannabis products. No one. And they do that because, again, there's no way to form a baseline. I just think that when it comes to the THC caps, when I hear that, it often comes from a part of this discussion where there's no real knowledge as far as terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles and how these work on the body. And I think that if we're going to start discussing limiting THC products, that's not a decision that needs to be made or pushed by folks who profit from medically assisted treatment. That's not a discussion I think that needs to be led by the recovery industrial complex. We need to have scientists, and when it comes to science, look him up. You can Google him. He's participated in a couple of these discussions before, but Dr. Greg Gerdeman is the leading expert in this country on the science of cannabis. And if you want to talk about THC caps and all that, I highly recommend that we bring him back into the conversation, because there's a lot of bad information out there. There's a lot of information being pushed by folks who have a financial stake in maintaining prohibition. And that has to be taken into account when we're discussing these issues.
Well, Rusty, I don't want to get into a debate with you. I mean, I'm bringing up a topic that I do think needs to be researched. And I take offense that you start, even when there's something that's brought up that is a point counterpoint, that you get defensive about it. I think it still does need to be researched. And if you have somebody that you feel could give good feedback, I feel like I have some people that could give, a point counterpoint, feedback on that kind of topic. And so, if we want to go down that road in the future, I'm open to having discussion as long as it's fair and balanced.
I absolutely, and I meant no offense. I get defensive about these things because it is my role to represent patients, not industry, not folks who have financial stakes in this game. I'm here to represent patients, and I know what patients need. I talk to them every day. I talk with folks who are on RSO. A lot of folks, I would venture to say, that serve on this board don't know what RSO is. It's Rick Simpson oil. It's one of the most concentrated forms of cannabis you can get. And for cannabis patients who are using it to reduce tumors, they need that 80 to 85% THC to get the job done. And these are things that I do get defensive when, because this has come up over and over. We had Dr. Gerdeman on here, and Dr. Gerdeman addressed all of these concerns, and I am open to an honest debate and discussion on the issue. I just think that if we're going to bring people into this discussion, we need to be extremely mindful to make sure that they're not coming into this discussion from a position where they have a financial stake in maintaining prohibition. There are a lot of folks who push Suboxone out, and these medically assisted treatments that can't stand cannabis. They can't stand the thought of cannabis as far as a method of harm reduction, because it's a 16%, and this is not me, you can research it yourself, Research indicates a 16% reduction in overall pharmaceutical benefit utilization the first year medical cannabis is implemented. Folks that make money off pharmaceuticals and medically assisted treatments don't like the sound of a 16% reduction in their profits. So I think that if we're going to have this discussion, we need to bring people in here that we have vetted and we know do not have a financial stake in this industry. That's all I'm saying. I mean, no offense to you personally. I get your concerns. I understand your concerns and they're definitely valid. I don't want people out there taking cannabis products that are, so strong that they're not getting a medical benefit out of it. They're just, getting high. That's not what we want. But I'm saying that if we're going to bring people in here to discuss the issue, we need to make sure that they're coming from a place of neutrality and not from a place where they're, worried about their profit margins. And that has happened in these discussions more than a few times.
Well,
Could we get back to the
disagree
agenda?
with you, Rusty. I'm sorry. I don't agree with you that we've had people brought in here that have had a vested interest in. I do not personally have a vested interest economically. I'm a person in recovery, and I deal with people who have had a problem with this drug and have had impairment, and and I'm going to represent that group of patients and people who are trying to get into recovery, and make sure that there's a safe product in West Virginia that doesn't get accessed outside the rails, and so, I do, I take offense too, that, you're implicating to some degree that I feel that I have some sort of personal gain in this, and that's just not appropriate, Rusty, and you know better than that.
I'm not saying you, sir. Again, there's no offense at you. I'm not saying you have a financial stake in maintaining prohibition, but some of the folks that have come in here to speak do and have had a financial stake. I'm not talking about you yourself, Mr. Deegan, and I apologize if you've taken it that way. But that,
Well, I haven't brought anybody in that I feel has a financial stake at this to speak on counterpoint. So I'm sorry, I don't agree with you on that.
Guys, I think there's going to be a lot of disagreement back and forth here, and we're getting pretty far afield from the topic for tonight. My suggestion would be we try to move back to impairment. I think it is important that we address the concerns that you both have, and I think we need to do that at a meeting where those topics are noticed. So my suggestion right now is if we can try to move back. We have kind enough to have the trooper appear here tonight, and I understand both of your concerns, but I would just ask that we try to move back into what's on the agenda tonight.
That's fine with me.
Yeah, and I apologize if I've taken the conversation off the rails.
I don't think anybody needs to. I don't think we need any more apologies. Let's just move on.
I'm sorry. I was listening to the debate. Did I hear that we can concentrate the THC to 75 to 80% THC? Did I hear that right?
Yes, Rick Simpson oil. There's actually products out there that that operate in that range. Yes, sir.
So how do you do that? Just real quickly.
Oh, well, there's a
THC.
process. There's multiple ways they can extract it. There's CO2 extraction, there's ethanol extraction, but basically the entire plant, when they make Rick Simpson oil, the way that Dr. Rick Simpson first made it, the entire plant, stem, leaves, buds, all of it, it goes through an ethanol wash basically, and it's soaked, it's decarboxylated, and then it's soaked, and then they basically burn the alcohol off. And what you're left with is this really tar-like, but there's people in the industry, a lot of people refer to it as flubber because it sticks to anything that it touches, but it's a very thick, very viscous medicine. And, cancer patients and people who are in going through terminal illnesses, they see a lot of benefit from it. But if you'd like to research it, it was invented in Canada by Dr. Rick Simpson, and I believe his website is phoenixtears.org, but he shows you step by step how it's made, how it was discovered, and there's a lot of links to testimonials from patients who have had experience with that product.
So if you can go and concentrate it to those levels, I guess I'm confused. I thought all along we were talking about trying to use the plant material for the benefit of folks and not necessarily trying to chemically alter the plant material for folks' benefit. And I guess
not-
my question would be then, if you can go and chemically alter it, why do we even need medical marijuana? Why
So
don't we
It's
just
not that
use
it's
cannabis
chemically
and just-
altered.
So I'd like to jump in here just a second from the ONC perspective. So we do have two different sides to this, the plant material side, the bud side, and then the extract side. So Joe, it's not being chemically altered. When you use that term, I would relate that to Delta 8 THC. What is happening here is concentration of the THC that's naturally in the plant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually know the process very well. And I guess I don't understand why we're doing that if we're trying to talk about medical marijuana. I thought we were looking at the plant side, trying to help people's deal with either terminal issues from a plant basis or those folks that had the various other diseases and ailments use the plant material to address it. I didn't realize we were trying to go and
Yep.
alter
So
the plant material into a.
Hey,
into
Joe,
a pill
just
or
to jump,
liquid.
Joe, this is Jesse, from the legal perspective, I mean, the initial bill didn't allow for the dry leaf of the plant to be sold at all. So the legislature initially only passed a version that would have allowed for the extracted parts. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but that's my understanding. I mean, that was later due to a recommendation of this board that they ultimately added the actual dry leaf of the plant. Initially, the only things that were approved in the law that was passed by the legislature were extracts.
that's correct. The original Medical Cannabis Act did not allow for patients to purchase plant material. It was only extract-based products.
But I don't believe folks envision those super concentration levels. That's the first I've heard anybody talk about concentration levels of THC to that level. That's
Well,
a
we've
pretty
had-
high THC
We've had
level.
some
Simpson
speakers
oil,
on
that's-
that. We've had some speakers on that at prior meetings, and it's something that we likely need to have a meeting about again. And really maybe some more information. We've talked about it before with the full board, about these levels, but there's been some very diverse opinions and prior speakers about these, as you've heard a little bit of here tonight with Rusty and Joe kind of summarizing those things. But in any event, I mean, I really think, given we're kind of getting a little limited on time, that if anybody has any other questions for the trooper, we may want to address those now if we can. And I don't mean to cut you off, Joe. If you have more questions, go ahead. But I do want to utilize, I mean, I think we're scheduled till 7, so I want to utilize that time. And we still have some public folks that may be on the Zoom here and would like to get any comments in too. Do any of the board members have any other questions for our speaker tonight?
No, I'd like to just again thank you, Sergeant Smith, for participating. We really, really appreciate your input, and thank you for taking the time to jump on here and share your thoughts on the issue.
No, anytime. Like I said, Jason has my cell phone and my email. Anytime you guys want to yell at me, I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have and tell you where we're at on it and what we're seeing, and work with you however I can.
Thank you, sir.
Sergeant, we really appreciate it. Anybody have any other questions for the Sergeant before we let him go?
Thank you. I do have one. I made a promise to somebody that I would bring this up.
Yes, sir.
So anyway, she is a nurse. She does hospice. She wants to know about, does the procedure for hospice, is it the same as what it is for like doctors that do chronic pain? Can they also get licensed through DHHR, and are they looked at differently when they issue a medical card for end of life?
I think I
So
can
there
speak
really-
to that.
So there really is no difference. A hospice patient or a hospice physician, being involved in our processes. The one difference I can state is that we do prioritize terminally ill patients. When they do apply for a card, they go to the front of the line. But every other process is the same, including the purchase limits. Does
Okay,
that answer
fair.
your question, sir?
Yes, sir, it does.
Thank you.
Yes,
But
thank you, guys.
just to make sure, Sergeant, you understand, and Jason will jump in if I have any of this wrong, but those hospice physicians would still need to go through the registration process with DHHR. And I mean, they'd still have to go through that separate training and be approved by the Office of Medical Cannabis to be able to certify patients.
Yes,
That's,
and their caregiver, right?
yep, that's correct. Every process is the same except the expedited nature.
Okay, that's fair enough. Like I say, I watch and see what she does, and of course, when those people get down to their end of days, they're not worried about failing a drug test or worried about what goes in their system, at that point. But no, thank you guys for having me, and like I say, I enjoyed speaking with you. And Jason has my number and has my email if I can come back and help you guys out in any way.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we, I know we have a few minutes left here. Maybe we could get into public comment at this time, unless any of the board members want to address or talk about anything we've heard this evening.
No, I would like to ask Jason just one real quick question. I've had a couple people reach out to me and ask about the process of signing up to be a caretaker. One woman in particular is taking care of, I think it's her dad. He's a terminal cancer patient. He's unable to go to the dispensaries himself. What is the process for her to sign up to be his caretaker?
Sure, I can address that. And actually, real quick, I want to point out for the members' benefit, OMC staff has been participating in the training of the state police and also county and local level police departments across the state. So we're doing our best to make sure law enforcement is as educated as possible on the Medical Cannabis Act. But Rusty, jumping back to your question, caregiver applications are very, very similar to patient applications. Same system, same fees. However, there's the addition of a criminal background check that's mandated by law for caregivers. The caregiver is responsible for the cost of that criminal background check. Only other thing I'd like to point out about the caregiver application beyond the background check is that they have to identify the patient that they're going to be a caregiver for. So that patient needs to have their card before the caregiver application can proceed. Then the caregiver can actually serve up to 5 patients.
Great. Is that application, is that also on the same patient portal that?
Yes, sir. That's
okay.
exactly the same system. Just once they establish an account, they choose caregiver instead of patient.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have any public comment this evening? I think the way we typically do it is if you're a member of the public or someone that's present that's not a board member and you want to speak, just type your name into the chat window there and or type an identifier for yourself into the chat window there, and then we'll call on you.
Looks like Dr. Husted would like to speak.
Yes, sir.
Jesse, do you want to set a time limit for speakers?
Yeah, I think we normally try to keep it under 2 minutes, don't we?
All right. Dr. Husted, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me talk. Like Joe was saying in the past, it seems like anytime someone has a contrary opinion to popular belief, Rusty tends to attack them. So I appreciate you letting me on. It sounds a lot like the pot calling the kettle black, saying that only Rusty's experts have no conflicts of interest when they've made millions and are set to make millions on this industry. In the US, it's set to make $33 billion this year in marijuana. I don't know what the recovery industrial complex is, but I know it does not make that much money. I certainly don't see that. I'm a physician that takes care of people with addiction. If I really wanted to make money, what I would do is I would step aside and not intervene in this at all, because I would be able to then treat more people who have cannabis use disorder, or talk to the families of people that are now have schizophrenia. And I've had to explain to, mothers of 20-year-olds that your kid is probably going to be on antipsychotic the rest of their life because of the high potency THC that they consumed for years. Or the child that committed suicide as a result of doing too much marijuana and their PTSD, which rates go up, not down, as has been suggested. Lastly, I would very much ask the board that I know in the past there's been some suggestion that opioid overdoses decrease with cannabis laws. The reality is that is not true. Typically, Rusty will point to a study done in 2014 from JAMA, and this was unfortunately premature data that was later reversed, that the association goes up, not down. So I would encourage in the future, anytime that's mentioned that somehow cannabis will magically end opioid overdoses, that we clarify that that is not the science right now. If it did in fact do it, I would be a fool to stand in the way of marijuana. If I knew that marijuana did in fact lower opioid overdoses, I would welcome that in a heartbeat. The reality is there is no evidence, there is no good science, not anecdotal stories. There's no good science that it lowers opioid overdoses. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir. Any other individuals that wish to comment? If so, please type your name in the chat. All right, Jesse, that looks like that might be it.
All right, well, that seems to be all the comments. While we have a couple minutes left with the board members that are on, does anyone have any suggestions for topics for our next committee meeting?
I think we still need to be discussing reciprocity.
Well, and we still had on the back burner how this affects healthcare facilities and rules and regulations that hospitals, FQHCs, mental health centers are going to need to propose in handling cases that end up in the hospital. And that's one of those that it's been out there for a while. We haven't really addressed. We have addressed reciprocity, and we can come back to that. But the healthcare facility issue has not been a topic for this committee up to this point.
But I get, for that perspective, we might consider, on the healthcare side, whether we could get maybe some folks in hospital administration, and then we could probably talk to some healthcare attorneys that might be willing to speak to the group. I could reach out to some folks that practice in that area. I'd be happy to do that. Anybody else have any topics they want to put on a future agenda? Well, Rusty, do you have an objection if we did the healthcare, if we lined up the healthcare and facilities sort of rules and regulations issue for the next meeting, and then maybe we could put reciprocity up on the meeting after that?
Yeah,
what I'm trying to do is just sort of streamline. We've had some meetings in the past where it seems like we've tried to put multiple things on, and it's almost too many things in an evening, and it's hard on the speakers, it's hard on everybody's. You end up with 2 or 3 hours of time, which I don't mind devoting to this. We're all volunteer members of this board, and that's what we do. But I think it makes more sense to try to keep these things in their individual items, and if we could do that, I think at least we're tackling each thing. Tonight we got some information that sort of showed what we knew, which is it's a bit of a brave new world in terms of impairment. I will say there is I know there's some comments in the chat box before we move on from tonight's topic. There are certifications for drug recognition experts in West Virginia in terms of law enforcement. And that is something that, you do see in drug DUIs, including DUIs where cannabis is suspected. I'll tell you from my legal practice experience, there are drug recognition experts. Typically, officers that don't have that specific training will call in an officer that does. And there's a separate set of, I know the trooper was talking about field sobriety tests, but just to kind of make sure, it's clear, there's a separate type of field sobriety test that are utilized for drug recognition. And under the National Highway Safety Institute and some other authorities, you have to have a special certification as a drug recognition expert to actually utilize those field sobriety tests in order for those to be valid later in court. So that is something that is ongoing already in West Virginia in some context. And then, as the trooper explained, I mean, this is a bit of a brave new world, but I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but just so, I do think it's helpful that we have those things independent, these types of conversations. So is there any objection to setting this facilities and healthcare rules and regulations topic for the next meeting?
No, not at all.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we do that? And maybe I'll be happy to try to reach out to, an attorney that might practice in that realm, and see if we could line someone up to speak from that perspective. Joe, I don't know if you had somebody in mind that you wanted to ask to talk in terms of healthcare administration, or if we need to reach outside of West Virginia, whatever you think.
Yeah, I think we could check with Jim Barry and some folks from WVU who may be, already trying to come up with their protocols at WVU and who they've talked to from other states, and we'll get back with everybody.
We've already done that, and that's a good idea. And one of the things that should be included is making sure that these facilities know how to treat the negative sequelae that they might see, like psychosis and cannabis use withdrawal and those kind of things. That's all built into our policy.
Okay. I know you've all been working on that, so I think that's something we can discuss further and maybe have it presented at one of these meetings.
Okay. And I know we've got some comments in the chat window with some suggestions there too, and appreciate those suggestions and comments. So thank you.
So Jesse, just for clarity and documentation on our end, the work group does not need OMC to facilitate speakers for the next meeting.
It sounds to me like we're okay to try to work those out on our own. I think if we have an issue, we'll reach out to you, Jason. And obviously, I think whoever we would line up, let's coordinate with Jason so that he knows who we'd like to invite.
Yeah, please try to give me at least 2 weeks notice on who you want to have attend. Jesse, second question, again, just for documentation purposes, does the work group want to take any official action regarding impairment?
I don't know that we got really far enough with things tonight to make a specific recommendation in terms of a standard to recommend to the legislature just yet. So I don't know, unless someone else has different thoughts from what we heard and discussed tonight, I'd be inclined not to make any official recommendation on impairment.
Okay.
Anybody disagree? That sounds like a no.
All right. Thank you.
All right. So we'll set the next meeting after when's the full board meeting, Jason? Just so we know and anybody that's on the line here can hear.
Oh gosh. I want to say June 16th, whatever the Thursday is around the
June 16th.
June 6th,
Okay.
12 to 1:30.
Perfect. Thank you. Just didn't have my calendar pulled up.
All right, so any public members that are on here that want to attend, June 16th from noon to 1:30 will be the full board meeting, and then we'll be scheduling another work group meeting after that.
I do want to point out for any interested parties that may be on this meeting,
Anybody not
Sorry.
speaking, please mute. if you can.
4649, I think that's you.
Thanks.
Thank you. For any interested parties, I do want to point out that next week's health and medical work group meeting is going to be canceled. Just got word of that about an hour ago. We'll officially make the cancellations for that tomorrow.
All right. Well, that sounds like we've sort of addressed everything. Does anybody have anything else they want to discuss? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Anybody opposed? Sounds like a no. All right, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.